Probably the worst movie ever made, Reefer Madness, back in the 1930s. And if you look at it now, it looks like sort of a comedy or a parody. But believe it or not, at the time, it was supposed to be a serious movie to scare people away from marijuana. This was back in the 1930s. And this was an era when crime in the US was being blamed on immigrants who were smoking marijuana, and eventually led to the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, which didn't make marijuana illegal, but it put such high taxes on it that basically it was commercially non-viable. In the 1930s, of course, marijuana was looked at as a pariah. But interestingly enough, historically, that wasn't always the case. The ancient Greeks smoked it, the ancient Chinese were into it, and it was all perfectly acceptable. Even in Europe, in the 1800s, it was. There was a club in Paris called the Club des Hachishins, where people got together to eat and smoke hash. Hashish is the resin that is scraped off the leaves of the marijuana plant. But what about science? Well, it was in the middle 1800s that William O'Shaughnessy, an Irish physician, got a job in India. And he found that people there were into pot in all kinds of ways. And he wanted to examine this scientifically. So he ran some pretty simple trials and discovered that people were alleviated of their anxiety, but especially in rheumatoid arthritis, he found that people benefited. And he also discovered that when people were struck down by tetanus, marijuana was able to get rid of the spasms that they had. But all of this was kind of swept off the board when the Marijuana Tax Act was introduced in the US. It was not until the 1960s that science was resuscitated. And that was by Raphael Mechoulam in Israel, who was the first to isolate the two most prevalent compounds in the marijuana plant, and that is tetrahydrocannabinol and cannabidiol. He determined their molecular structure, he devised ways of synthesizing these in the laboratory, and this is what has led to modern research. And we now have all kinds of marijuana products available, and yes, it is perfectly legal here in Canada. All of these have been legally purchased. Well, what are they? There's so many different varieties. These contain tetrahydrocannabinol, an oil that you can put under your tongue, or of course the ground up plant that you can smoke. You can also get some products that are enriched in cannabidiol, and you have those here. This joint is essentially made of cannabidiol. Of course, it's got other compounds in there as well, because the marijuana plant has about 400 different compounds, but it is really high in CBD. Of course, we don't really know enough about all the other compounds in there, and it may be that some of the components are more valuable therapeutically than THC or CBD. So we certainly need some more research in this area. But there already is some evidence that CBD is very effective for anxiety control. It can help you sleep, and it can also help with the nausea associated with chemotherapy. THC is the hallucinogenic component, or the psychotropic component of the plant, and there is also some evidence that it can do some good, especially when in conjunction with CBD, but unfortunately the products are very difficult to standardize. You don't know exactly how much you are getting, and we certainly need proper randomized controlled trials. But I think when the results of those do come in, we'll find that there is some evidence for using these substances medically, and that this movie made in the 1930s, I think, is going to need to be remade with some emphasis on the therapeutic potential of the interesting compounds that are found in cannabis.